How do you feel when you switch to Geico and save on your car insurance? It's like going to work on one Thursday morning and thinking to yourself, just one more day until Friday. But then somebody in the elevator says, Happy Friday! Then you check your phone quickly and discover today is actually Friday. So yes, Happy Friday, random stranger in the elevator. Happy Friday indeed. Yep, switching and saving with Geico feels just like that. Get more with Geico.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You have my sword.
And you have my bow.
And my trowel.
Hi, you're listening to episode 32 of And My Trowel, where we look at the fantastic side of archaeology and the archaeological side of fantasy. I'm Tilly.
And I'm Ash.
And this is the second part of our discussion with Dr Sigrid van Roode, chatting all about magical amulets. Welcome back, Sigrid.
Hello, hi.
So let's just remind ourselves of where we were before we were interrupted by our remembering to deliver a package to the museum. So while searching, it's my fault as well. While searching through the archives of the Fellowship of the Trowel Society headquarters, we stumbled across what appeared to be a magical amulet. But what kind of magical amulet is it, and how can we possibly research it?
So we've looked at the representation of magical amulets in the world of fantasy, but what about if we look at the archaeological evidence? Are there such things?
What do you say, Sigrid?
I say yes, there are, and
Excellent.
plenty of them.
Good. So what's your sort of favourite example? I mean, what immediately comes to mind when someone says to you, the archaeology of magical amulets?
That is difficult because here we enter immediately the difficulty of archaeology, especially when it's from a period in which we do not have written sources, that we have actually no idea how to interpret it, some jewelry that you find. So I was thinking, and that was why I started saying blah, 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 about the amber beads, for example, that you find in Neolithic prehistoric burials. Are they jewelry in the sense of adornment? Are they wealth because these things may come from afar? Or are they amulets based on comparisons with cultures that still live today and that attribute meaning to amber? So, that's really a difficult question. What immediately pops up in my mind is we don't know.
What kind of clues would there be to sort of tell you that an object might have been considered as magical or an amulet?
When there is writing on it, that would be most helpful. Sometimes you have these magical inscriptions on them. They can be little prayers. They can be invocations. They can be a series of gibberish that just invoke the power of writing itself as an act, but do not mean anything necessarily. And you can maybe see something from the context in which it is found. So is it worn on a specific place on the body? Has it been associated with other objects that we know to have had magical function? And otherwise, it's usually a sort of a guessing game, I'd say.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So do you find them predominantly in burials as well, these amulets?
Well, that's also the thing. When we find human remains, that usually is in burials. So that is when you find jewelry that may be associated with that person. That might be an amulet. That's a lot of may and might and maybe and possibly, like an archaeologist.
Yeah, I'll say it sounds like archaeology.
It sounds like archaeology, right? And then there is things that are not jewelry that have been buried intentionally, like foundation deposits. You have these witch marks on posts and on buildings and on other things. Churches also, graveyards, that sort of thing. But that is not jewelry. But you do see sometimes the same repetition of patterns that you see in these inscriptions repeated in jewelry. Like, for example, the knot, which is a very powerful symbol because it's ambiguous, really. It can go both ways. You can use knots to tie something together, to keep it together, to fasten something, and so giving it permanence. But you can also use it to strangle, to bind, to make sure that something else doesn't move. When it's a really complicated knot, the general idea is that evil, which is apparently not considered that smart, gets lost in knots, in labyrinths.
I mean, I don't blame it, really.
Yeah, it follows its own tail kind of thing, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. It just runs up a certain avenue and then gets caught up in the knot that you place there. Well, okay.
Which is a good trick. If you're ever being followed by like an evil spirit, just tie lots of knots.
Confuse it.
Yeah.
Confuse it with something gleaming, for example, also. That also works.
Okay, well, there you go, which is why you have a magical amulet. Sorry, carry on.
No. There's also like that kind of almost amulet thing where, especially in Scotland, and I think it happens in other places too, but like in the 17th century, they put witch stones in walls. Do you ever find
witch stones?
Yeah, so it's literally just very shiny stones, and they put them in a little bag, and it like draws all the evil that could possibly enter the house into the wall. And then it's shiny, and they're like, "Ooh, look at the shiny stones in that bag. I'm just going to sit in there forever."
Blink. What was the terminology we learnt in the last episode? Bling,
bling, bling.
Blingy things would be the scientific term for this.
Yes. Okay, sorry, Sigrid, I interrupted you.
No, but so that is one way of recognizing if something can be an amulet. If you find these patterns on a piece of jewelry, it may have had a double function, but that also goes for the materials used, for example. So you have the shiny objects that indeed blind evil or distract it. You have dangling, jingling things. Note that in the lexicon of scientific terms. Blingy, dangling,
jangling, dingly
things.
Yeah, that's it. Evil is apparently also easily scared away. So you have these beautiful Hallstatt brooches, these big clanky things. That jingling also announces the person coming, like Terry Pratchett announced the witch coming. Yeah. But it also scares evil away. Apparently, evil is very fidgety and easily scared and distracted.
That's so interesting that like amulets are almost meant to be heard as well as seen.
Or smelled.
Smell as well.
Smell is also a part of amulets, but that is, archaeologically speaking, very difficult to ascertain.
I can imagine.
I know that feeling, yeah.
Well, yeah, sure. Speaking as a candle maker here.
Candle maker who looks at archaeology all the time. Yeah, I totally understand that.
But you mentioned, so I mean, this is sort of talking about indeed archaeological sources where you don't have the written sources. But you mentioned last episode, your sort of specialism is the last kind of 100, 150 years in various parts of the world. So is it then easier to be able to identify these things if you have that written source, and how are you able to basically relate that back to archaeological sources as well?
Well, yes and no, because it's never easy with magic, is it? So on the one hand, you have written sources that detail spells and rituals and acts and things that you have to create, quite literally. And that helps, of course, a lot, because then you have literally a fabrication manual for an amulet. But what you also have, and that is something that has given me much food for thought to interpret magic in the past, is the role of what I now call, for lack of a better term, the wise women. Women that are not necessarily witches, but the elder women of a generation, say people who may have read a certain children's book like 40 years ago, that age group, they have seen it all by the time they reach 50, 60 years old, and they create amulets that are often very much based in the immediate surroundings of a settlement. So an example is, I went through all of Winifred Blackman's amulets. She has collected tons of amulets in Egypt in the 1920s. And these are now in the Pitt Rivers Museum. Part is in Liverpool. There are some in the British Museum. I went through all of these just to see if I could find some common denominator for which type of amulet does what. And when I went through them, there's literally thousands of items. At some point, I thought, Winifred, my girl, you have been duped, because there were pebbles and pieces of rock and pieces of bone, and that were described to help against spirit possession, spirit possession by two sheikhs. A sheikh is a possessing spirit. Spirit possession by a girl, spirit possession for boys who have been possessed, but also pain in your left knee, headaches.
I could do with that.
Pick up any pebble. And then I thought, okay, so if it is not what it looks, if it's not visually distinguishable, then maybe it's the process in which it became an amulet. So then I imagine there's someone coming to one of these wise women and saying, oh, I have cramp in my left leg. What should I do? And she would say, well, go out at sunset or at dawn to this and this place and pick up the first piece that jumps out at you, that catches your eye. And that then would become the amulet. If you look at it this way, all we are left with as archaeologists is the material remains of a process that we do know nothing about. So, yeah, anything could be an amulet. Is that confusing enough?
I love that basically the end result of this podcast, these 2 episodes, is going to be, we don't really know anything about the past. We can't tell if something's magical. And if we do, it's very confusing. Which, I mean, is archaeology in a nutshell. But it reminds me a bit as well. I mean, this idea of the magical amulets and everything, it's almost... Yes, sometimes it's the physical representation, but like you say, they were told to go out and like pick up the first pebble that they saw, but then in doing that, they would probably exercise their legs, and in doing that, they would work out the cramp in their leg and everything. This reminds me of, and I hate to bring it up again so early in the episode, but Sherry Pratchett.
Early in the episode, are you joking? This is the latest you've ever done it. We're 11 minutes in.
So Granny Weatherwax is she's not the head witch, but she, because witches are non-hierarchical, but she is the headest witch of the non-hierarchical witches. And her thing is, called headology. And she basically, like, I can remember there's one scene where she's basically telling a man who has a bad back, and she's like, oh, drink this sucrose aqua mixture and lie on the board of an oak tree that has been, hardened for this long, and and he's going, oh, right, so that like the knots in my back can go into the wood. And it's like, oh, Granny was impressed. She hadn't thought of that, that kind of thing. But yeah, she's basically telling them to do things that will be like biologically beneficial for them, but in such a way that it's like, yes, and you need the tree of an oak that has seen 5 winters under the moonlight of the blah, 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 or whatever. But it's basically like, just put a board under your bed to make it a bit more solid so that your back gets better, which I guess is a lot of what magic is and what magical amulets are as well.
It is. There is such an analogy between our world of every day and everything, things that we do that get translated into jewelry. I mean, if you return to knotting, we do that all day long. You knot so many things, especially in antiquity when we don't have zippers and Velcro. There was a lot of knotting to be done. So that can be a magical act, like pinning a fibula, for example, a clothing pin. That in reality, of course, the practical sense, it keeps 2 things together. So if you do that with intent, it might also become a love charm.
Oh. Yeah. The intention behind it.
Yeah. But when you excavate a fibula, you cannot see that, whether it has been used as such.
Which I guess is what we were saying last episode as well about our own jewelry and how, even though on the outside it might just look like a pretty piece of bling-a-ling, it's the meaning behind it indeed, and the sort of interpretation, which is so interesting.
And that is also what I find with archaeology. You also have to consider it in its own time frame. Because, for example, take amethyst as a material. Pliny writes about that. This is going to be a golden tip for all of you listeners, that it works against drunkenness. It prevents drunkenness. So what you do is you take an amethyst, you tuck that in your mouth when you go to a party. Somehow you need to keep it there, and then you will not get drunk.
Because you can't drink.
You can't drink because you're too busy trying to keep this amethyst in your mouth.
But then when we move to the Middle Ages, you have the German Hildegard von Bingen, who writes that amethyst is absolutely perfect for skin irritation, skin rashes, skin diseases. Both of these things, of course, go back to amethyst being this blotchy, purple-colored stone. So it could either be the color of wine or your face when you've had enough, or irritated skin. So it works through analogy that is relevant in that particular culture. And from this, we learned that apparently in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of skin diseases going on. Which is how jewelry works as a historic source.
And I mean, you mentioned different cultures and stuff. Like, do you notice it as well? Do you have any particular because you've worked with a couple of different cultures and different historic groups? Are there sort of different representations of magic or different ways that magic is shown, or is it do you see a lot of patterns?
I see so many patterns that are similar. The underlying principles always almost are the same. It's analogous magic. it's a form of do ut des, I give so you will give. There's a lot of threatening going on also. If you do not heal my son, I will smash your statue, kind of, stuff. Very threatening. It's in the analogies themselves that we lose track of what they actually meant. So there are a lot of solar symbols, for example, circles, triangles, might be a goddess, could be a mountaintop, could be a pyramid, could be a skirt, could be so many things. You need to see that in their specific cultural context.
Okay, well, I think with all this information and all this knowledge, although we can definitely try to make a start on interpreting what this object that we have certainly is. But before we chat further about that, anyone for second breakfast?
Oh, yeah. Good shout. We'll be right back, everyone. You can't beat a good mushroom and potato omelette, in my opinion.
Couldn't agree more. Yep. So, now that we're feeling refreshed, Sigrid, based then on your experience as a jewellery historian, how would you approach our particular scenario? So we have this amulet. What actually is your practical approach, your methodology, shall we say, when you're looking at a new item of jewellery?
Okay, so first I would ask you where you got it from. So I know it's on the back of a shelf in your archives, but how did it get there? And if you do not know, I would want to know who rented the building before you. So how did that piece of jewelry come into your possession, and what, if anything, do you know of its previous history? And then I would, do what any archaeologist does. So take measurements, do a description, find parallels, if anywhere, and from there try to piece together what this might be.
Okay. And I mean, in terms of, because you mentioned in your own sort of research, you're looking at a couple of different cultures. You mentioned kind of Dutch historic and prehistoric items, but also North African and Asian cultures. Are there different methods or approaches for these different cultures in terms of ancient history and jewelry?
For the methodology, I usually just do the same process, but it's the different contexts that is always important, because something really simple, white is a mourning color, mourning as in grieving, for one part of the world, and in the other part of the world it's black. So it's really relevant, the context that any piece of jewelry comes from.
So does that mean the material is also relevant? So what can that material tell us, if it's made from silver, or if it's got a jewel, or...
Yes, absolutely. The material is very, very relevant, again, in its context. There is a colleague of mine who has done research into amulets from Palestine, where she found that there are amulets that have been made of twigs. And this is from the 1920s, this collection. And these twigs had to come from a very specific type of tree that grows in a very specific location. So if we were to find such a thing in the Netherlands, that same background would not hold true. So we'd have to look in a different direction.
So you need to know, you don't just need to know about jewelry, you need to know so much about the cultural background. I mean, I guess you could say the same with archaeology, but it seems to be extra essential with this.
Especially since jewelry is portable, it travels a lot. So it might end up in a different world. One of the things that I love the most about pieces that carry meaning, that could be even an amulet, is the Ballycotton cross. That is, I think it's now in the British Museum in the Silk Road exhibition, which is an early medieval cross. So it's of equal sides, equal arms. And in the center, it has an intaglio, an inscribed stone in Arabic, which is set not in its normal reading direction. I believe it's either completely inverted or in vertical. Anyway, that is two levels of meaning mixed into one piece. And it could very well be that the person who used that Arabic amulet thought, well, I can't read this, but it must be powerful. So going to smack it in the middle of a cross, and then the cross will be extra powerful.
But didn't know how to actually read the Arabic, so just put it in as they thought it was. kind of thing. Wow, that's really interesting. And if you're looking at different kinds of jewelry as well, and they're different. I mean, this is probably just going to be really boring because you're probably going to be like, no, it's all the same. But I need to ask the question anyway. Because you mentioned you've looked at rings, you've looked at kind of amulets in terms of, or sort of necklaces. You've looked at, you mentioned scent in the last episode as well. Is that also, so are there different kind of approaches depending on where it was worn, how it was worn, that you would look at?
On the body, you mean?
Yeah. Or the way it was used, I guess.
Yes, because, well, here for this, you would also need insight in the culture itself. Why do you wear a particular piece of jewelry on a particular space on your body? And is that different from regular jewelry, which may indicate that it is an amulet, like under your clothing versus over your clothing, for example? And then there is, when you talk about scents, in current day Morocco, there is a specific scent, and this is also very useful information, that is used to undo spells. So that is burnt, just in general. It's not worn on the body or anything, it's just burnt, and it will undo spells. But the flip side of this is that it will also undo spells that are beneficial to anyone. So if you went to, say, a magical doctor for, I don't know, a medicinal problem or something, and that person would have prescribed you an amulet, do not go near this smell, because the amulet will be annulled.
Oh, okay.
That's so interesting.
It's that classic, right? If you're like, if I have to get rid of my whole deck of cards now, I'm going to lose this cool thing, but I'm also going to lose these like poison things that are in there.
Yes.
Which,
But that's interesting, because Tilly almost assumed that you were wearing an amulet. So does that mean an amulet doesn't have to be an item of jewelry and you don't have to wear it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about jewelry basically because I'm a jewelry historian, but an amulet can literally be anything. So it can be a pattern that you paint on your walls or carve into your doorpost. It can be an object that you bury in your house, or something, just an object that you position somewhere in your settlement. I think even words can be an amulet. If you say words that you feel protect you from something, smells can be an amulet. Amulets, literally everything can be an amulet.
God, this is going to be a really big job, isn't it?
But yours is tangible, right? You have a tangible ornament.
Yes. Object.
So,
That's true.
There you
we
go.
have a tabular. So in terms of sort of measuring things, description, writing things, finding parallels, but like, are there any ways, I mean, can you give some examples of pieces of jewelry or items of ancient jewelry or modern jewelry or historic jewelry that have been interpreted as some kind of magical amulet? And what were the clues that gave that description?
Yes, well, of course, I just wrote an entire book of these things, so they're still on my forefront of my mind. So there is jewelry that was used in Egypt in a possession ritual where women would experience that they were possessed by a spirit. That spirit would make them feel terrible, and then the thing you do is you ask the spirit, what do you want? What does it take for you to leave me alone? And in that ritual, jewelry was used. And that is also basically the very short synopsis of my book. Everything can be an amulet. So there you go. But what distinguished they're not really amulets, powerful pieces that were used in that ritual is their engraving. It shows pictures of spirits. And the fact that it sports dangles, so it made a sound to keep evil at a distance. But on the other side, we're talking about pendants that have been engraved on two sides, is a religious text from the Quran, which is the throne verse. So the interesting thing is that when it was worn, it would be worn with the spirit side towards the wearer. So you could not see that from the outside. From the outside, it looks like a regular pendant that carries an accepted text, a text that is known to be very powerful against evil. On the other side would be the imagery of the spirits that were possessing you. And that makes it sort of stand out as a different type of jewel, not just your regular jewel.
How did they know what the spirit was that possessed them to draw it?
That is what you would need a ritual specialist for. And that would also be, again, one of these wise women. And she would know from experience which spirit it was that was troubling you. But here's also one of the things that we haven't touched upon yet, but which I find really interesting in materiality of magic, if you could say. There's an entire economical world actually surrounding this. So this ritual specialist, she would be sort of like a business partner of the silversmiths. And she would tell them, like, you need to engrave this type of spirit or that type of spirit. And of course, when you think about it, almost all amulets need to be purchased if they are ready-made amulets, if they're not, the pieces of bone that you need to pick up. The services of the ritual specialists need to be paid for. There is literally an economy of magic going on, which is also something that I find really, really fascinating.
It sounds like a great business model. Not gonna lie.
To say. If this podcast fails, Ash,
I know where I'm going.
Start up when the Archaeology Society crumbles to dust. We can.
Sigrid, do you want in?
Oh yeah, count me in. I've got the age, so yes.
You'd be a wise woman.
I'm still waiting for that magic to happen.
I'll be the wheeler dealer that goes, I think you're possessed by a spirit. So I've got a friend actually.
Other people going, I just happen to have engraved the perfect spirit engraving on this existing necklace. Oh, look at that. That'll be £50, please. And I mean, would it have then been, at what point does magic amulets stop? Or, what point because magic is something that we see so much in kind of mythology and in ancient texts and in historic sources, but when does magic start to become less kind of normalized in that respect?
Well, again, difficult answer, because my first inkling would say never.
Never.
I mean,
of course it is, everyone listening in.
Listen, look at every one of you out there. Look around you. How many eye beads can you buy in your local drugstore, for example? How many car amulets, car angels are out there? We still feel that intrinsic need, I think, to wear amulets. Now, the thing is that in research, magic is still a little bit frowned upon. I see a trend in which looking into ritual practices and magical practices is increasing. So that it's becoming more serious, I think. People are taking it more seriously as a research field. But in everyday life, magic is everywhere. Everywhere.
I suppose it's part of your life way as well, especially culturally, and then even now. I mean, I know I talked a bit about my jewellery that I wear, but I'm convinced if I take off a piece of jewellery, something bad will happen. And I don't know why. It's just like ingrained in me that if I somehow take it off, something bad is going to happen to my family or something. So I think they're a bit of amulets and and if I'm doing certain things, I'll wear certain jewelry that'll help me. And it's not necessarily logical, I think.
No, but I do.
But I do it all the time. Yeah,
it's the feeling and it's the significance of it to you.
Yeah, but then that's magical in a way, isn't it? It's part of what I believe in, my life ways of interacting with the world. And if that piece of jewelry helps me, then why am I not going to do it,
Well, there's also talking about, what in the humanities then is called, agency, which is a very fashionable term for the meaning that a piece of jewelry or an object can have. We have right now in the Netherlands, in our National Museum of Antiquities, a fantastic exhibition on the Bronze Age.
Yes.
And in that exhibition, for the first time since the Bronze Age, are 6 swords, or dirks, you could call them, that have now been reunited for the first time, that possibly have been made by one and the same maker. Oh, wow. They are fantastic. They are powerful. They are absolutely goosebump-inducingly beautiful. They are now reunited for the first time, and I saw them on that exhibition just last week. And I'm a very rational archaeologist who does not read fantasy books. So, just that's me. I was looking at that setup of these swords together, and my first idea was, would something happen now?
I was about to say, did a portal open?
Yeah, exactly. But that's the feeling that you get from seeing these objects. So I think magic is inherent still in the world. It's present. It's whether you choose to do something with it or not that makes all the difference.
Oh, well, I think that's an excellent sentiment to start wrapping things up with. So, Ash, I see that you've been taking notes. So what would you say would then be our kind of approach to this particular amulet?
So we have to look at the context of the object,
yes,
as Sigrid said. So how did it get there? What it's made
Where did it come
of,
from?
where it come from. Maybe someone else rented our property beforehand.
Yeah, look at the archives.
Then we should take measurements, descriptions, and find parallels. So a bit of research behind there as well.
Yeah.
And perhaps look at what the materials it's made of and understand what the significance of that material is. And look to see if there's anything on either face of the jewellery.
True. Yeah, we need to check anything scratched in, anything added afterwards that might be to make it into an amulet. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Well, Sigrid, before we wrap up, is there anything in particular that you would like to share with our listeners? Any exciting research coming up? Any exciting projects you want to talk about?
Wow, there's so many interesting projects that I could fill a podcast on that, I think. So no, other than a warm invitation to download the book, which says it's really impossible to distinguish between jewelry.
Otherwise, the summary is we don't know how to have anything magical. But here's some really cool examples that might be, which is basically archaeology again, I think. And if people want to follow you or find out more about what you do, where's the best place to do that?
That would be my website, bedouinsilver.com, which is also where I run a blog. This might interest you, on magical jewelry and amulets.
There you go. Perfect. Yeah. We will put the link to that down in the show notes, so do check that out and follow Sigrid there. That's about it for this episode of Am I Trial. We hope that you enjoyed this quest. Thank you so much, Sigrid, for helping us out with this particular problem. It was so great to have you join us, and we've definitely learned, if not tangible information, we've learned about how to approach the situation, which I think is the most important thing. So thank you so much.
And we've learned that magic still exists.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And as always, everyone listening in, we are always open for new episode ideas. So if there's any suggestions that people have for an episode, maybe you've gotten some inspiration from a fantasy book, maybe there's an archaeological concept or material that you don't really understand, but we might be able to help to explain through fantasy. Maybe there's something in a book that you want to find out more about the archaeology of or the history of, anything like that, get in touch via email or social media. All of the contact info for us, as well as for Sigrid, and references and for further reading for all the points that we've discussed today can, as always, be found in the show notes.
Tilly, have you looked outside recently?
Outside? No, why?
Well, is it me? Or has that oak tree in our courtyard just grown an extra couple of meters, overnight?
Oh, what? Yeah, I think you're right. Do you think we should tell someone about this?
Actually, we already know someone who can talk about this.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.